Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Maria Teresa Landi. I am a scientist at the National Institutes of Health and the moderator of this panel on the emergence of the human face. I'm delighted to introduce three renowned speakers today that will guide us through the foundations of biological evolution, and specifically to the evolutionary journey that led to the emergence of human beings. We, human beings, are aware of our connection with the animal world, and yet our experience tells us that we are unique. So it is important to ask what science can tell us about this connection with the animal world, but also what lies beyond the boundaries of the scientific method. So we asked the speakers today to guide us through the principles and mechanisms of evolution and their relevance and limitations for an explanation, for a definition of man. As Pope Benedict XVI once said, to evolve literally means to unroll a scroll, that is, to read a book. It is a book whose history, whose evolution, whose writing and meaning we read according to the different approaches of the sciences. And we have with us scientists today who represent three such approaches. Doctors Ken Miller, a cell biologist, Martin Nowak, a mathematician, and Rick Potts, a paleoanthropologist. So I think we can begin with Professor Miller. Kenneth Miller is professor of biology at Brown University. A cell biologist, he serves as an advisor on life sciences to the NewsHour, a daily PBS television program on news and public affairs, and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Miller is co-author with Joseph Levine of a series of high school and college biology textbooks used by millions of students nationwide. In 2005, he served as lead witness in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial on evolution and intelligent design in Pennsylvania. His popular book, Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, addresses the scientific status of evolutionary theory and its relationship to religious views of nature. His latest book, Only a Theory, Evolution and a Battle for American Soul, addresses the continuous struggle over how evolution is to be understood in American society. And you can find in the New York Encounter program a huge, impressive list of honors that Professor Mill received. I just want to mention here that in 2011, the Society for the Study of Evolution recognized Dr. Miller with the Stephen Jay Gould Prize for advancing the public understanding of evolution. And most recently, Notre Dame University honored him in 2014 with a presentation of the Letare Medal. So, Ken, we hear a lot about evolution, and particularly when it relates to the evolution of man, there is quite a hot debate between different sides. Yet the impression is that there is quite a lot of confusion on what evolution is really about. And most often, this debate is not grounded. So can you tell us, or at least give us some elements of the foundations or the fundamentals of Darwin's laws of evolution and also their scientific demonstrations?
Well, I will do my best, and thank you very much for having me here. Human evolution remains a flashpoint in American education and culture, and you don't have to look very far to see examples of things like state legislatures passing laws to promote the teaching of alternatives to evolutionary theory. When the Cosmos series was aired recently on one of the cable TV channels, there was even a station in Oklahoma that blacked out one of the Cosmos programs and omitted any mention of evolution. And I think the reasons for concern about evolution, particularly relevant to this group, clearly are religious in nature, and they play into the stereotype of science versus faith. I can't tell you how many times in public talks I've been asked the very question that you see on that church slide. If man evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? And I have to tell you, I want to tell you how I answer that, which is when I'm asked that question, I tell the person, I'll answer that in a second, but first I have a question for you. Where did Protestants come from? And they look at me a little strange, and I say, come on, it was the 93 Theses, Martin Luther, it was in, oh, they said, oh, I guess Protestants came from Catholics. Are Catholics still here? There's the answer to why monkeys are still here. And if you'd like to bring this up in a contemporary way, Texas was actually the latest, not the only, but the latest battleground. And it was a battle over a single textbook, which had such a strong treatment of evolution that the Texas Board of Education deferred its approval. I show you the cover of this horrible textbook right here. If you look closely, you will see my name on the cover. It was, in fact, my textbook that was held up. And in fact, once it was sent out for expert review, it was clear that it in fact gave a very strong and coherent and correct treatment of evolution, and now is widely used in the great state of Texas, something of which I and my co-author are very proud. I'll give you another example of how people are concerned about evolution by a potential presidential candidate. This is Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas. And a couple years ago, when he was asked for his views, he said, if anybody else wants to believe that they are the descendants of a primate, they are certainly welcome to do so. But of course, Governor Huckabee does not believe that. Now, I've always wanted to meet Governor Huckabee, and maybe if he runs this year, I can go up to New Hampshire, not far from where I live. And if I do, I'll call him aside. I'll tell him I really like a lot of his positions. He's an energetic campaigner. He's a wonderful guy. But Governor Huckabee, you are a primate. And not only that, so were your mom and dad. So you are most certainly descended from a primate. And he might be tempted to say, well, is it Darwin who said that? And the answer is no. It wasn't Charles Darwin. It was actually a God-fearing creationist named Carolus Linnaeus, who in fact was the first person to recognize, and these are his books, that human beings are indeed primates. Now, evolution by natural selection is an astonishingly simple idea, and it rests on 4 verifiable premises. 1, there's variation in natural populations. 2, in any generation, more offspring are produced than can possibly survive to maturity. 3, as a result, there is a struggle for existence. And 4, characteristics that are beneficial in that struggle are going to become more common in a population over time. And number 5 is a conclusion from those, which is over time and given new variation, this can lead to the emergence of new species. Now, evolution is actually a lot more complicated than that. And I put this slide in not because anybody can read all of this stuff up there, but this is from a college biology textbook showing a variety of evolutionary mechanisms, not all of which are related to natural selection, that drive evolution. And you'll hear more about these from Martin Nowak. When we look for evidence from evolution, inevitably we look for fossils. And there are many, many ways to show that the statement here by the National Academy is true, which is we have so many intermediate series that document evolution that it's sometimes difficult to know where one species leads off and another one begins. A great example of that are the series of fossils that document the evolution of the first tetrapods, the first land 4-legged vertebrates, which we now understand in great detail. If you'd like to read up about this, there's a wonderful book by Carl Zimmer, a great science writer, called At the Water's Edge, talking about 2 very, very compelling fossil series in which we understand how life moved from the water into the land. Human evolution tells a similar story. And Rick Potts, who's going to speak at the end of our session, is going to document the details of that. But my work is in cellular and molecular biology. And I have to tell you that the most spectacular evidence of evolution is actually found not so much in fossils, but in the human genome itself. And in fact, this is an issue of the journal Nature from about 10 years ago, in which the lead article basically pointed out that molecular data have spectacularly confirmed Darwin's inference that we share recent common ancestors with the other great apes. And I want to give you two quick examples of that, which I think are really compelling. We are placental mammals. All placental mammals, when they develop, when you and I developed as an embryo, form a yolk sac. And there's a photograph here of a human embryo with the yolk sac like a balloon next to it and a drawing from Gray's Anatomy. Now, what's peculiar about this is that our yolk sac has no yolk in it. It is empty. So why do our embryos form a yolk sac that encloses absolutely nothing at all? If you looked at design principles, it would make no sense. But if you understand that we mammals evolved from animals with yolk-containing eggs, suddenly the presence of that empty yolk sac makes sense because it's part of our evolutionary developmental history. Now that's just structure, it's morphology. But here's the insight. If we descended from creatures that once laid yolky eggs, maybe there are genes for the yolk protein, which is called vitellogenin, lurking somewhere in the human genome that would betray our evolutionary ancestry. We now have the tools to look for that. And guess what? They are there. The human genome actually has 3 copies of genes for the yolk protein vitellogenin. They're all broken. None of them are functional, but they sit there as a remnant to our evolutionary ancestors. Now, the late Stephen Jay Gould once called such things senseless signs of history. They provide proof, as he put it, that the world was not made in its present form, and neither were we. We have an evolutionary past. There's another senseless sign of history in our genetics. We humans have 46 chromosomes. All the other great apes have 48. Why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Well, the only way to explain that is the 2 chromosomes that are still separate in the other great apes must have gotten accidentally fused in us to form a single chromosome. That would drop us to 46. But that's a testable explanation. If it's true, then our genome ought to contain the remnants of 2 chromosomes recently fused together. How would we recognize that? Turns out to be easy. I've sketched 2 chromosomes here. The tips of every chromosome have very special sequences called telomeres, which I've sketched in blue. If one of your chromosomes had been formed by the fusion of 2 chromosomes that very recently were separate, you know what it should look like? It should have telomere DNA right in the center, and it should have 2 sequences rather than 1 known as centromeres. Do we have such a chromosome? You bet we do. It's human chromosome number 2. And it also betrays our common ancestry with these organisms by virtue of that fusion site. Now, molecular studies, and I put some representative books up here, including one of my own, that have described this for lay readers. Molecular studies confirm our evolutionary ancestry and our relationship to other organisms. Now, I want to close by pointing out what I think this means. A distinguished professor of biology, David Barash at the University of Washington, wrote a much-cited op-ed in the New York Times this year, called God, Darwin, and My College Biology Class. And he wrote that every year I have the talk with my students. The talk isn't about sex or drugs, but it's about religion and science and how they don't get along. And what Dr. Barash wrote was that evolution has demolished pillars of religious faith. And in particular, it is an undirected and natural process, not divine creation, that gave rise to us. And he finds that to be antithetical to religious faith. But I would ask, is it really a problem to point out that life was generated by purely natural processes? And I recall a quote from St. Augustine, which is that the universe was brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structure and life forms. Augustine would have been at home with the idea that life could be created from the natural world. And Barash also wrote that we have no supernatural traits. We are made of ordinary molecules. Well, we are. But is it a problem to think that we are an ordinary part of the natural world? I read another book once that said, "Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return." We surely are part of the natural world. And in fact, he also wrote, the more we know from evolution, more we're drawn to the conclusion that living things are produced by a natural and amoral process. Now, it's true that the process of evolution does not require a divine explanation. So we can ask another question, however, which is, why should nature support the extravagant creativity of the evolutionary process? Science itself has no answer to that question, but faith may see that as the work of the very same creator. And in fact, when Dr. Barash at the end said that he would give this talk to his biology class, my message to him would be to skip the talk and just focus on biology. Evolution, fully and properly understood, does not support the case against God that he wishes to make. In a very real sense, an evolutionary design to life is part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. The capacity for evolutionary change is built into nature, and this can be understood, if you are a believer, as part of God's providential plan. The distinguished paleontologist Simon Conway Morris put this in his wonderful book, Life's Solutions, about the convergent properties of evolution and the emergence of humans on this planet. So what I would say in conclusion is that we do not need to find room for God in the evolutionary process, because if God exists, the process of evolution itself is part of a natural world of his own making. And in the Catholic context in particular, this fact has been very clearly stated by three popes, Pius XII, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, and most recently by a fourth pope, Pope Francis. Very much a friend of science. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Clearly now we have more clarity on the foundations of this evolution, and you already introduced it in a way. The next speaker, Martin Nowak. Martin Nowak is professor of biology and mathematics at Harvard University and director of the program for evolutionary dynamics. He works on a mathematical theory of evolution, including the evolution of cooperation and human language, and the dynamics of virus infections and human cancer. An Austrian by birth, he studied biochemistry and mathematics at the University of Vienna. He then went to the University of Oxford as the Erwin Schrödinger Scholar, right? And became professor of mathematical biology. In 1998, he moved to Princeton to establish the first program in theoretical biology at the Institute for Advanced Study. He received his present position at Harvard University in 2003. A corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, Nowak is the recipient of several prizes, including the Weldon Memorial Prize of Oxford University, the David Starr Jordan Prize of Stanford University, and the Akira Okubo Prize of the Society for Mathematical Biology. Nowak is the author of over 400 papers and 4 books. And you can read much more on this outstanding work of Martin on the website of the New York Encounter, or also in the program. So Martin, in your book, The Super Cooperators, in 2011, and also many related articles, you proposed that natural selection, genetic variation, etc., mutation, is not enough to explain reality, I mean, the reality of the evolution. You propose that cooperation is another force of evolution. And while natural selection, as we have heard from Ken, is based on a competition between individuals, so it introduces a conflict, cooperation instead means that an individual, if I understand correctly, pays a cost for another individual to receive a benefit. Can you tell us more?
Mm-hmm. some more. That's the topic of my talk, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I will talk about evolution of cooperation and why I think that cooperation is a fundamental principle of the living world. But before I begin, as Terry said, I'm a mathematical biologist, so I want to tell you a little story what that means. And there is a shepherd and a flock of sheep. And a man comes by and says, if I guess the correct number of sheep in your flock, can I have one? So the shepherd says, okay, try. So the man looks and says, 83. The shepherd is amazed because it's the right number. So the man picks up a sheep and wants to walk away. And the shepherd says, hang on, if I guess your profession, can I have my sheep back? And the man says, please try. You must be a mathematical biologist. How did you know? Because you picked up my dog. So in my field, as you can tell, it's about getting the numbers right. And so today, I hope we get the numbers right for evolution of cooperation. And here already 3 examples of cooperation. On the one part of the slide, on the left side of the slide, you can see filaments of bacteria as they already existed 3 billion years ago. So these are individual cells that form these strings like pearls. And every so often, a cell dies in order to feed the others with nitrogen. So here we have an extreme form of cooperation where one cell gives its life in order to feed others. In the middle of the slide, a kind of cooperation that came into existence 125 million years ago. These are social insects. And in social insects, workers do not reproduce themselves, but they help the queen reproduce. So why do they give up their own ability of reproduction in order to help another individual to reproduce? This is a question that was asked by Charles Darwin. If everything is just natural selection, how would we get the design of such an animal? And on the right part of the slide, an example from our own evolutionary time, so from right now, so that was just 2,000 years ago. That's the Good Samaritan. This is a painting of Vincent van Gogh. So people help one another. Why do people help one another? That's a fundamental question. If it is just natural selection, if it's just survival of the fittest, why would cells, animals, or people help one another? And here you see an image of the Fukushima power plant and the rescue workers, the first ones that were called to give help. You know, I can show you a similar image, of course, of the disaster of 9/11 and the rescue response of the firefighters that came in there willing to help. And you could ask them, why are you doing this? So as the Fukushima power plant was melting down, a worker in his 20s was among those who volunteered to re-enter. He knew that choice might prevent him from ever marrying or having children for fear of burdening them with health consequences. He was asked in an interview, why did he do this? And he said, there are only some of us who can do this job. And I'm single and young, and I feel it's my duty to help solve this problem. Why do people help one another? Here's another example from this city here. The New York subway hero. All of you, or most of you, know the story of the man who was waiting there with his daughters on the way to school in the New York subway, and he observed another one having a seizure and fall down in front of the train. And as the train, with the headlights already visible, was coming into the station, he jumped down in order to get this person up. And then he realized it was too late to get him up, and he pulled himself over it and put him down and protected him. And the train went over both of them unharmed. Very few of us would be such heroes to actually save other people other person's life at such great danger, but all of us, I think, have the remarkable intuitive, instinctive feeling, oh my God, something very dangerous is happening here, what can I do to help? What can I do to help this other person? So the question is, why do we have this instinct? Why does evolution equip us with such a sense of helping another unrelated individual? Do animals have this? Presumably not. If they see one animal dying, why would they really bother? It's a competitor. Why do people have this? And this has to do with the question of cooperation. And this is a timeline that I show to my students at the beginning of every class, sort of to put everything into perspective. You can ask the physicists, how old is the universe? And the answer is 13.7 billion years. How old is the sun, the earth, the moon? About 4.6 billion years. When was the origin of life? Around 4 billion years on earth. That's the conjecture, but the evidence is by 3.5 billion years there was bacterial life on Earth, chemical evidence for bacterial life. By 1.8 billion years there were the so-called eukaryotic cells, the cells with a nucleus, the higher organized cells. By 600 million years we have complex multicellular life. And in the last order of 1 million years, between sort of 1 and 7, 10 million years, the origin of humans, of human language. For me, these are the great steps in the evolutionary process. And the observation is for these great steps in evolution, you actually need cooperation as a kind of master architect. It is not only competition. With competition, you get better and better adaptation on the same level of organization. But cooperation is that which brings about more complicated levels of organization. Cooperation brings about the emergence of multicellular organisms. Cancer, for example, is a breakdown of cooperation among the cells in a multicellular organism. Cooperation brings about social animals, it brings about human species. So what is it that evolves? Populations of reproducing individuals. The carrier of the evolutionary process is the population of reproducing individuals. Mutation means that new types arise over time, and selection means that different types grow at different rates. So these are the two fundamental forces of the Darwinian evolutionary process, mutation and selection. And to this, I would argue, you actually have to add cooperation as a third fundamental force, because only cooperation is that which gives you the emergence of complexity, the shift from simple organization to more complicated organization. In a very simple mathematical sense, cooperation is an interaction between two individuals, cells or people, where there's a donor and there's a recipient, and the donor pays a cost and the recipient gets a benefit. So the question is again, why should you help somebody who is a potential competitor? And this interaction between two people leads to a very famous game in game theory, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. And in a moment, I want to play this prisoner's dilemma with all of you, but here are the rules of the game. So you cooperate or you defect, and I cooperate and I defect. And if there are only two parameters in this game, the benefit, the cost, the benefit of cooperation and the cost of cooperation. So if you cooperate and I cooperate, then you pay the cost because you cooperate, but you have the benefit because I cooperate. So you have B minus C. If I defect and you cooperate, then you only have the cost of your cooperation, minus C, but you have no advantage because I did not cooperate. But if you defect and I cooperate, you have plus B, you have no cost, just a benefit from my cooperation. And if you both defect, it's 0. So we can put some numbers there. For example, benefit is 3, cost is 1. And these are the rules of the game. So what is written here is a payoff matrix, and in that payoff matrix I have specified what you will get. And you have to decide now whether you want to cooperate or whether you want to defect. So we will decide simultaneously, and I ask you, who wants to cooperate with me? Please raise your hand. Who wants to defect? I should say it's not an optional game. In game theory we have optional games also, where you have a third possibility to do nothing, but here you have only two choices, cooperation or defection. So let me ask you again, who wants to cooperate? Who wants to defect? So that is the most cooperative society I have ever seen. So the only even more cooperative society I have seen was recently in Beijing, where there was an audience of 2,000, nobody defected. But New York is pretty cooperative, But so this is how you should analyze the game. You don't know what I will do. Let's assume I cooperate. If you cooperate, you have 2 points. But if you defect, you have 3 points. What is better, 3 or 2? So 3 is better than 2. So if I cooperate, it's better for you to defect. If I defect, you have a choice between 0 and minus 1. 0 is better than minus 1. So if I defect, it's also better for you to defect. So no matter what I do, it's better for you to defect. If I analyze the game in the same way, we both get 0. And that's bad, because it would have been better had we both cooperated, because then we get 2. This is the kind of Nash equilibrium analysis of a game. The Nash equilibrium here is to defect. So the dilemma is, do so-called rational players, in the sense of game theory, defect and end up with a low payoff, but do irrational players might cooperate and receive a higher payoff? Cooperation is irrational, but human experiments show that people are not necessarily rational. They behave in a way that they wish that they could cooperate, even though in that situation it doesn't make sense. So here we have used the field of mathematics called game theory that was invented by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern. Von Neumann, a Hungarian-born genius, also built the first programmable computer in Princeton, actually. The interesting thing is you don't need the colon rationality to actually explain that defection is chosen. Also, natural selection chooses defection. In a population where there are random cooperators and defectors meeting each other, defectors always have an advantage. They always get a higher payoff. So for natural selection to favor cooperation over defection, you need to provide some help. And this help is given in terms of mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And these mechanisms also explain why you here predominantly wanted to cooperate in this game, because the human intuition is a cooperative one. So there are 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation: direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, and kin selection. And I will very briefly discuss these mechanisms. They form the environment where natural selection shaped the intuition that people have, why they want to cooperate. Direct reciprocity means I help you, you help me. So the idea is we play a repeated game. And in a repeated game, it makes sense to cooperate because we can establish a relationship that is mutually beneficial. Human cooperation is not only explained by direct reciprocity, there's also indirect reciprocity. So the Good Samaritan did not think, oh, that's the repeated game, and in the first round I cooperate, and then later this person will help me. There's something else going on, and this is what we call indirect reciprocity. I help you, somebody helps me. If I'm in that situation, I wish somebody would come by here to help me. Indirect reciprocity works via reputation. We are always acting in a way conscious of the idea that others might observe us. My friend David Haig at Harvard said it, for direct reciprocity you need a face, for indirect reciprocity you need a name. Indirect reciprocity has to do with people talking to each other about others. It has to do with evaluation on the internet. It has to do with trust. Spatial selection is the idea that neighbors help each other. So we form clusters of helpful people and they can survive in a competitive, exploitative world. Or in social networks, you can say friends help each other. You help your friend and you form a community of friendship. Group selection is really an idea that goes back to Charles Darwin, and he said there can be no doubt that in a tribe, including many members who are always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So the idea is that you have competition between groups of people, and in one group people help each other, and that group is favored over a group where people do not help each other. Finally, kin selection is the idea that interaction occurs between genetic relatives. I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins, was a statement that G.B.S. Holden made, a founding father of population genetics. So you help those who are genetically your relatives. So I talked about these 5 mechanisms: direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, and kin selection. And they are interaction structures that help natural selection to favor cooperation over competition. But in the interesting observation of my work on such games and such interactions over the last 20 or more years, what I found is that winning strategies have these 3 properties. They are generous, hopeful, and forgiving. Generous in the sense that they don't necessarily demand always the larger share of the pie. So sometimes you are willing to accept a deal where the other person gets more than you, but you have a good interaction. Hopeful means that whenever you see a stranger, you start with cooperation. You hope to establish a cooperative relationship. And forgiving means in a repeated interaction, if somebody defects against you, you forgive. You can move beyond this and you can start with cooperation again. And these are properties of winning strategies in these mechanisms. And finally, I should say that right now we are faced with the biggest problem of cooperation ever, and this is the question really how to establish cooperation on a global level in order to solve the climate problem. And that also includes how to cooperate with future generations, because we want to leave them a world that has an ecosystem that is habitable for the human species. So we should be paying a cost now such that future generations have a benefit. Right now we are doing the opposite. We are actually burdening them with debt. We are spending their money now and they can pay it back later. We are destroying the environment and they should repair it later. And that's actually a problem. We have to shift from this defection with the future to actually cooperation with the future. Some of these ideas that I mentioned today are in 2 books, and one is called Super Cooperators, and which is a biological book, and then another book that I wrote with a professor of divinity at Harvard University and now at Cambridge University, which is on the discussion of evolution, cooperation, and Christianity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Becoming really, really interesting, and we will ask Rick actually to illustrate this with pictures. But let me first introduce Richard Potts. Paleoanthropologist, is the director of the Smithsonian Human Origins Program and curator of the anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History. Since joining the Smithsonian in 1985, Rick has dedicated his research to piecing together the record of Earth's environmental change and human adaptation. His ideas on how human evolution responded to environmental instability have stimulated wide attention and new research in several scientific fields. Rick has developed international collaborations among scientists interested in the ecological aspects of human evolution. He leads excavations at early human sites in the East African Rift Valley, including the famous Handaxe site of Olorgesailia, Kenya, and Canaan, near Lake Victoria, Kenya. He also co-directs ongoing projects in southern and northern China that compare evidence of early human behavior and environments from Eastern Africa to Eastern Asia. He received his PhD in biological anthropology from Harvard University in 1982, after which he taught anthropology at Yale University and served as curator of physical anthropology at the Yale Peabody Museum. Rick is curator of the David Koch Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum and has authored the companion book, What Does It Mean to Be Human? So, Rick, we heard the basic foundations of biological evolutions and the theory of cooperation, and you participated in these excavations of early human sites. So, can you illustrate with some pictures of what you found or others found in the caves during your excavations, how the biological evolution played a role in the origin of humanity?
I'd be happy to, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to be here. And I thought, given the theme of this session is the emergence of the human face, I would start in a very literal sense with human faces, or with the faces of ancestors and relatives of ours who science joined together with our own species, Homo sapiens, as part of our unique evolutionary branch in the tree of life. These are the faces of the close kin. They all of ourselves. They all have different scientific names. The names sometimes read like a Russian novel. You don't have to memorize them all. But they do represent ways of life that united in their own way some combination of the features of what it means to be human from a biological sense, what we think of as uniquely human traits. As far as we know, all of them, like all other primates, were highly social, living in social groups. Some of them, over the last 2.5 million years, made tools, mainly tools of stone. Many of them had large brains, and even some of them, such as the Neanderthals, which is featured in the upper right-hand corner, had a symbolic sense, or at least the roots of a symbolic sense. They're known to have made occasional art objects, modifications of the environment that seem to have no specific function and perhaps an aesthetic sense, illustrating an aesthetic sense, and occasionally buried their dead with grave goods, such as colorful flowers. And yet, despite these fractions, some of them great deal of the fraction of what it means to be human biologically of what we represent today. None of these species are on Earth any longer. They all have met their demise, and that's, I think, one of the most profound and provocative aspects of understanding our evolutionary history that has arisen over the last several decades. Now, we used to think of these species as forming a linear arrangement leading to us. And this was a narrative of human origins that had a sense of inevitability to it, an arrangement connoting progress, inevitably leading to ourselves. And of course, this kind of art, it has become an icon of cultural progress that you'll see in magazines and newspapers, even in advertisements. In fact, this happens to be my favorite. Somehow leading to perfection, a Guinness beer. That will be later. We no longer think this, but rather instead that we see ourselves, yes, in this particular representation as being at the top of the tree where it says "you are here," with faces indicating the diversity of humanity today, but all within one species, that we're part of a diverse and branching array of species, all of them related to us, even though they do not exist today. And so our evolutionary tree is seen as diverse and branching, much like the evolutionary trees of virtually all other organisms. Now, how do we know this? We know this through the fossil record, but we also can place a somewhat different concept, or consider a different concept of the human face, and that's the way of life that we know of as being human today. And so at the bottom of the slide, we have, going back to 3.5 million years ago, the famous series of footprints that are embedded into the volcanic ash in northern Tanzania, discovered by Dr. Mary Leakey. We have in the arc of skulls, and bipedality, our ability to walk upright, is one of the first keynote traits, one of the first milestones along the path that define the origin of all of those species that are part of our evolutionary tree. The arc of 5 skulls that you see there are just a few of the skulls. There are, that represent 2.5 million years of human evolution, showing changes from the left, bottom left, to the right, where we see a skull of our own species, Homo sapiens, that arc representing the changes in brain size and the size of the face that can be illustrated, that has taken place through time. The skull representing our own species on the bottom right. We're the only mammal whose face is tucked under the brain case. All of the other earlier human species, the face is hafted onto the front of the brain case. And so that's a mark physically of what is uniquely human about our species, as seen by paleoanthropologists, anatomists, and so on. But then in the upper left, one has, again, a few objects representing 2.5 million years of changes in the objects that people made, in our ability to alter the environment and to make things, from simple choppers to hand axes, that oval object in the middle, to at around 33,000 years ago, the earliest known sewing needles made out of ivory and bone. Those particular ones come from China. And then the explosion of art, and what I'll show in a few moments, is some of the earliest evidence that we have found of using color that is often seen to represent, to be emblematic of the origin of the human being, to be symbolic, to be able to create color, and as a critical part of understanding group identity and presenting and expressing group identity. And so the human fossil record 100 years ago was known from a few dozen fossils, mainly those of Neanderthals in Europe. But now there are about a little bit over 6,000 fossil individuals that are known, representing the last 6 million years of human evolutionary history. Some of them are nearly complete or quite complete skeletons, to sometimes just isolated teeth. But then added to that are tens of thousands of archaeological remains that are the echoes of the behavior of those ancestors and relatives of ours. Not just the ability to make tools, but the ability to make fire, to interact with the environment in ways that transformed the ability of humans to persist in a changing world. And so we can see in, this slide, not that slide, but this one, a timeline of human evolutionary history. It's a pretty complex slide. If you can see the numbers starting at around 6 million to 2 million years at the bottom, and then near the present up at the top. And we can see that the advent, the emergence, the accumulation of features was not all at once. It was an accumulation over time where various things were added, from walking upright to changes in diet to the ability to flake stone and to begin the roots of being able to modify the environment going back to 2.5 million years ago. The ability to disperse long distances, to have changes in technology. The greatest rate of increase in brain size occurred over the last 1,800,000 to 1 million years. The emergence of fire and home bases, places that the group members return to over and over again. The ability to transport material and to exchange it over long distances with distant groups, perhaps indicative of the initial sense of cooperation, not just with members of your own group, but with others a distance away. And then our symbolic abilities, much more recent in time, and then the diversification of cultures and of histories, the splintering of the human experience, but based upon these changes that become part of the universal story of our origins, the story, the narrative that belongs to every person, not only in this room, but all over the earth living today. Now, sometimes I point out to audiences that my research combines the two least controversial areas of science in American society: evolution and climate change. And we see, actually, with the study of climate change, that the evolutionary venture, our evolutionary venture, took place in an era of enormous environmental challenge and uncertainty. And so this is a fairly complicated slide. It goes from 3 million years ago on the right to the present on the left. And this is something that has become known about African climate dynamics or climate variability just in the last 10 years. In fact, I published a series of articles. Well, I'm in the midst of publishing a series of articles, the first of which came out last year, which shows that the time period of human origins in Africa had this alternating sense of high variability, great instability of environment followed by stability, instability followed by stability through time, and you can get a sense of that there. But mathematically, this can be shown, and the explanations are known from looking at astronomical cycles that help control the climate conditions of Earth. And what we have found in the analysis of human evolution when put into this environmental context is that the key transitions in human evolution, the origins, the earliest known origins of our species, Homo sapiens, but also the development of each of the key stone technologies over time, all of the major extinctions and geographic dispersal events, all of these occurred, happened to be situated, based on our current evidence, in the most prolonged periods of high climate variability, of climate instability. And so climate instability seems to have been this cutting edge between thriving and decline, between survival and extinction in the era of human origins. We have this metaphor that perhaps you've heard, that East Africa or Africa is the cradle of human evolution. I now tend to think of it as the cauldron of human evolution, reflecting the roiling events and churning process that typified the time period of our evolutionary origin. And so after several million years, the sole survivor of that diversification of bipedal species, we're the only ones left, Homo sapiens, worldwide in extent, and we are really a turning point in the history of life due to our evolved capacity to survive in a changing world. Let me just show you very briefly some of our recent finds, not quite yet published, but I know this small group can keep a secret. That we, in our excavations in the Rift Valley of southern Kenya, where we are able to look at places where are eroded hillsides and gullies, where rain and water expose artifacts and fossilized bones on the ground, and we come in and we excavate what nature has already begun to expose, and we find these things, these objects. And we have, in this particular site where I've led excavations for the last 30 years, 700,000 years of stone hand axes, one layer after another of stone hand axes. But there's a change that occurs between 500,000 and 320,000 years ago. And this 320,000 years ago is part of the beginning of one of these prolonged periods of high climate oscillation. And what we see is a smaller, more diverse, more mobile technology, the beginning of human innovation. We have careful ways of preparing rocks such that with one strike of the rock and the, whoops, sorry, you can't see that, but what you see up here is the same as what's down at the bottom of the slide, that with one hit of the rock that you get over and over again these triangular points. These are the earliest known projectile points, things that fly through the air, and the world has never been the same since. And we also find the earliest evidence of pigments, of coloring material, again, emblematic of the symbolic sense of creating group identity. We also have many of those objects there are of obsidian that are actually traded with groups about 100 kilometers away, groups that cannot be seen but are kept in mind by the groups. And so we have this element of our humanity of being able to imagine a value system that one can trade with a group such a long distance away. And so what we see then, also in addition to these changes, during the same period of change in human evolutionary history, that we see a turnover, a change in the animals that were also there in the Rift Valley of Africa. The extinction of large-bodied grazing elephants and hippos and pigs and baboons and zebras, and the emergence of the kinds of animals, exactly the species that you would see if you were on safari in East Africa. And so what we have then are these innovations near the origin of Homo sapiens. The timeline at the bottom is about 300,000 years long. We see the first evidence of Homo sapiens fossils at about 200,000 years ago. And we see these innovations over time of being able to transport long distances of a symbolic sense and so on that seem to even precede the earliest evidence of the origin of our species. Behavior as the leading edge to the things that we see paleontologically as the human face. And I would see all of these because they occurred in a period of very prolonged climate oscillation. This increasing innovation, the wider social networks, complex symbolic activity, evidently in indicating language, and also complex thinking and planning, that all of these have to do with a greater capacity to adjust to new environments. And so we used to see adaptation in human evolution as occurring on an unchanging stage, a stage that may have looked something like this. You put these early bipeds out on an African savanna, and there were these kinds of precarious dangers that ultimately led to our lineage overcoming these dangers, dominating it to have dominion over it. But now we have a new narrative of human evolution based on the environmental records fused with the study of human evolution. And that new narrative has something to do with a transformation from perhaps the dangers, the precarious nature of living like this, as you see on the screen, and ultimately having ended up with the possibilities of this. That's not a story of adaptation to one single ancestral environment, but rather it's the opening up, it's the liberation of human beings from any one ancestral setting, of having the malleableness of culture and language and being symbolic, that is a story of adaptability, not inevitability. And so finally, it leads to a question, as I go back to this evolutionary tree. The provocative question is a matter of, are we it? And that question used to make us wonder. It used to make us wonder, are human beings the end of creation? Are we the pinnacle of evolution? But now I think that we must be in awe of, and I believe quite humble in the face of a different meaning, a far more poignant meaning to that question. We are the last of that radiation of species, of this radiation of species. We are the last biped standing. And so the question, are we it, invites us to examine, not just to react to, but really, truly, and deeply explore how humanity can possibly thrive, change, and adjust in a future that continues to be a changing world. And with this new kind of question comes astonishing responsibilities toward understanding our place in the world and our deep impact on it. Thank you.
So thank you, Rick. Clearly, we have heard about cooperation, forgiving, symbolic language, all of these aspects that define human beings. But the question that I really would like, you alluded to, each one of you, but I really want to specifically ask, to what extent does the biological evolution, as we have heard, explain what man is? I mean, when I say man, I mean me, you, our perception of ourselves, longing for beauty, for happiness, the fight for ideals, for justice, for freedom. How much all of this, is explained by biological evolution? So I will start with you, Rick.
Okay. Sure, that's an easy one, isn't it? Well, science and those researchers who are motivated to explore and understand our evolutionary history really have very little basis for claiming that the human, is solely about anatomy, is solely about our physical appearance. And I've tried to explain a little bit in my talk about how we dig. We uncover things, fossilized remains and stone tools and those echoes of behavior that go beyond the mere physical. And so we dig up these things that were once buried in darkness and that shed light on the roots of our existence as living, ever-changing, and ever-challenged beings. And I think that connects up with those elements of our humanity that are not specifically explained by changes in genes. I recently read in Anthony Doerr's book titled All the Light We Cannot See. Perhaps some of you have read it. But there was a wonderful, toward the end of the book, a reflection on the human brain, and it referred to the human brain as one wet kilogram within which spin universes. That's a paraphrase, but our brain's actually a bit more than 1 kilogram in weight, but it contains and it creates intricate universes and meanings that go beyond the material structure of the brain. Our neuroanatomy joined with our social brain, the social networks of which we are a part, create astonishing narratives and meanings. And so is our existence through an understanding of biological evolution simply a physical manifestation? No one I know who studies the archaeology of human origins would ever say that. Instead, the pigments that I showed that seem to indicate the roots of our symbolic selves, in those pigments, the use of color that they imply, I see the beginning of what we might call metaphorically as the human face. Those rare and valued pieces of obsidian traded with groups 100 kilometers away connote the beginning of awareness, a consciousness about other people who cannot be seen in your immediate social group. And so in those little tiny innocent artifacts, I see the emergence of what metaphorically we might call the human face. And so the human face is something more than its physicality, something more than physical appearance. And the study of evolution actually discloses this fact and helps us document it. It exposes the ancient timing of transformations in human nature, and especially the emergence of our cultural nature, within which music and beauty and a variety of other concepts and histories emerge out of. And so I think that evolution helps us, or the study of it helps us understand the reality of those elements of our humanity that set the stage for seeing things and powers unseen, and for remembering histories, and for developing faith. And so while some people may put huge barriers between science and reason and faith and reason, I see no conflict.
Thank you. So I was impressed when you quoted 1 kilogram is more than the entire universe. I mean, it reminded me of famous Pascal definition, man, that is one single man is more than the entire universe because he's aware of itself and the universe. What do you think?
Well, what I'm always struck by is the dualism that has often been part of Western culture. And I don't just mean mind-body dualism, but the tendency to set ourselves apart from the rest of the living world. We are indeed something special, but the notion that we are somehow fundamentally different from nature implies that we evolved out of nature. And I prefer to say that we evolved with nature, that we are part of the natural world. I'm often approached by my students when I teach my introductory biology class at the university, and I go through, DNA and RNA and the Krebs cycle and biochemistry, the transmission of nerve impulses and so forth, and occasionally asked a question which says, do you mean that we are nothing but collections of molecules, or mere molecules? And my usual answer to that is, yes, but there are two words I would strike from the sentence. And those two words are nothing and mere. Because matter is not mere. Matter is extraordinary. We are made out of matter. The late Carl Sagan characterized us and the place we have in the universe this way. He said that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And what the evolutionary process has done is to take the dust of which we are made, the matter and energy of which we are made, and somehow make that matter self-aware. It's an awareness that thrives in each of us, everywhere in this room and everywhere on this planet. And the mystery of how matter becomes reflective and thoughtful and self-aware, from my point of view, is the mystery that biology has always tried to solve. We are closer to solving that mystery today than ever before. Evolution does not explain everything about human nature, but it is the origin of human nature. And it's only by understanding our origins that we begin to understand who we are in the first place and where we may be going. And that understanding, I think, is the most precious gift that science can give us.
So you would say we understand the origin or the method, the how we evolved, because I think it's different, right?
Well, I don't want to say understand in the sense that there's nothing for Rick to do anymore in terms of understanding completely, because there's always mystery in science. Right. But the markings of evolution are everywhere in our bodies, in our genetics, and our genome, as I tried to point out. So we understand that evolution is the beginning of how we became to be human. But it is not the end of it. It is, in a way, our foundation, but it does not limit our potential. And I see, in a way, that William Faulkner famously said when he accepted his Nobel Prize, that I believe that ultimately man will do more than just survive, he will prevail. And ultimately, the biology of our own human nature, it will be the key to how we will prevail, not just in the struggle for existence, but in the struggle for knowledge and to understand our place in the universe.
Martin, what do you think?
So, Thomas Aquinas said that God is the teacher both in terms of faith and reason. And that's actually the starting point of the Summa Theologiae, and I find that statement very impressive. So we like science and we like faith, we like religion, and he asks, is both necessary, or what is the role of both? And he says, reason alone would be enough in principle, but it would take too long. So therefore faith is a kind of shortcut to make it easier for people to understand where they are. And something else which he said, which was very impressive for me, is that every argument against the Christian faith can be shown to be wrong based on reason alone. So if somebody makes an argument against the Christian faith, you do not have to call upon faith. You actually can disprove it by reason alone. And that I find beautiful. So for me, it is obvious that science, mathematics, philosophy does not constitute arguments against religion or against Christianity. And the kind of scientific atheism that we are witnessing these days is a kind of a social construct and is in some sense the formation of another kind of religion. So for me, the scientific atheism that is preached by many of my scientific colleagues is almost as a new kind of religion, completely overstepping the actual interpretation of the scientific method to say, and what we have now learned proves that God doesn't exist, sort of creating a metaphysical position that in itself is faith-based, like a religion, showing that humans cannot be without a religion, in my opinion. So for me, language is a human universal and religion is a human universal. And then the discussion between faith and evolution, I want to tell those people of faith, do not be afraid of evolution. Evolution is a beautiful scientific theory, it has some explanatory power. In the same way as you do not feel challenged by gravity. As if I tell you Newton described gravity in order to explain how the universe looks like on a large scale, you don't feel challenged in your Christian faith. So evolution is in the same way no challenge for the Christian faith. When Newton actually had the mathematical equations for the laws of gravity, for him there was the question suddenly there, is this now a challenge? If I have a mathematical description of gravity, do I take away from God? Then he made the famous remark, hypothesis non fingo. I do not make a hypothesis as to why there is gravity, I just describe it mathematically. In the same way, I don't make a hypothesis as to why there is evolution, I just describe it mathematically.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Thank you, because my point was exactly this, that the why is a question that it doesn't pertain to science per se. That's more the description of how we go. But I think that, as you said, the best way, in a way, to address this question, to what extent evolution explains human nature, is by looking at our experience. If we look at our experience, we cannot deny that there is something mysterious about reality. And we, scientists, have this experience all the time. You know, even if we begin with a hypothesis, then we test it. Even if we prove exactly what we predicted, there is a sense of surprise when the results is in front of us. And I mean, each one of us cannot deny that there is this mysteriosity in reality that appears all the time. And if we look at our experience, we have the way to address it, the question, I think. And I wanted to mention that in his book, The Religious Sense, Father Luigi Giussani, by the way, Father Luigi Giussani, that is the founder of Community Liberation, also wrote a book that is called The Man as the Self-Awareness of the Cosmos. Exactly what you just said, you know, is that we arrive to the point of nature in which nature can reflect on itself. Anyway, this, in another book, The Religious Sense, he wrote, modern mentality reduces reason to a group of categories in which reality is forced to find a place. And whatever does not fall into these categories is defined irrational. But reason is like an eye staring at reality, greedily taking it in recording its connections and implications, penetrating reality, moving from one thing to another, yet conserving all of them in memory, trying to embrace everything. A human being faces reality using reason. Reason is what makes us human. And it is this broader reason, which the scientific methods is one of the available tools, that governs our experience. So in closing, if you allow me, I would like to close just looking at our experience. I mean, if we consider our experience, I mean, is it enough for a mother to think about a man, to define a man, to define her own son as a more advanced, evolved animal? I mean, is this enough for a lover, for a friend? In itself, there is something that goes beyond. The experience tells us. Anyway, we had, before this meeting, 3 hours of conversation. We wanted to go on and on and on. Clearly, there is a lot more to discuss, and time here is short. So I just wanted to invite everybody that is interested to at least 2 additional meetings within this encounter where we can continue this discussion. First of all, immediately now, in a few minutes, at 5 p.m., in our Sunday Visitors Hall on the 2nd floor, there will be a presentation of an exhibit of evolution, which will be on display throughout the entire encounter on the 2nd floor. And tomorrow, at 3 p.m., at the Human Adventure Books booth, located in the Encounter Plaza here on the ground level, Dr. Robert Pollack, a biology science professor at Columbia University, and his wife, Amy, will sign copies of their recently published co-authored book titled The Course of Nature, a book of drawings on natural selection and its consequences. So see you all there, and thank you.